Hello, I'm Bartholomew Barry Johnson, and I'm here to share my story, a story of high-stakes adventures, relentless determination, and a past that's as colorful as it is perilous. I used to be an FBI agent, and throughout my career, I developed a reputation for outsmarting criminals and negotiators alike. My work took me deep into the underbelly of organized crime, where every case was a test of both intellect and grit. It was in those challenging moments, amidst shifting alliances and life-or-death confrontations, that I learned the true value of strategic thinking and unwavering resolve. I've always believed that a strong mind and a cool head are indispensable when facing dangerous individuals. Whether it was negotiating with ruthless syndicates or outmaneuvering sophisticated criminals, I honed my skills in environments where every decision could be the difference between success and disaster. My past is filled with moments where ingenuity and quick thinking carried the day. Moments that shaped me into the man I am now, a man who isn't afraid to take on tough challenges, no matter how dangerous they might be. After years of adrenaline-pumping undercover operations and high-tension negotiations, I decided that it was time for a change, a new chapter that promised a measure of peace and quiet. Seeking solace and a fresh start, I moved to Pleasant Valley and purchased a modest bungalow. The decision to settle down wasn't made lightly, it represented a conscious desire to escape the constant pulse of danger that had once defined my everyday. I yearned for an environment where I could nurture a hobby, perhaps gardening, and where the most pressing concerns would be about the color of my hydrangeas rather than global conspiracies. Even though I traded intense FBI operations for the serene rhythms of suburban life, the lessons I learned in the field continue to resonate with me. Those experiences have instilled in me an unwavering sense of justice and a keen eye for detail, especially when it comes to protecting what's rightfully mine. My past has prepared me well to handle any sort of challenge, whether it involves unraveling a complex criminal case or dealing with everyday disputes that escalate beyond simple disagreements. I'm not one to shy away from speaking the truth, even when it might ruffle a few feathers. I believe in holding my ground and taking responsibility for my own life. And while I might be settling into a quieter existence here in Pleasant Valley, the instincts for service remain an integral part of who I am. They serve as constant reminders that no matter where I go, I carry with me the legacy of a man who dared to face danger head-on and emerged with stories and scars that remind him of battles won. Today, I invite you along on this journey, one that bridges the gap between a thrilling past and a promising, peaceful future. Welcome to my story. After years spent deep in the world of undercover operations and high-intensity pursuits, I, Bartholomew Barry Johnson, decided it was time to trade covert danger for a taste of genuine tranquility. Tired of the relentless pace of FBI life and eager to build a sanctuary free from constant peril, I relocated to Pleasant Valley. Here, amid gently rolling hills and friendly neighborhoods, I believed I could finally find the peace and quiet that had long eluded me. I purchased a modest bungalow that exuded charm and warmth. With its wide porch, freshly painted exterior, and a small but well-manicured lawn, the house promised more than just shelter, it beckoned me to start a new, quieter chapter after years of covert operations and life-or-death negotiations. The bungalow quickly transformed into a refuge where I could nurture simple pleasures, from tending to a small garden to enjoying lazy afternoons with a good book. Moving to Pleasant Valley was not just about escaping my past, it was a deliberate choice to embrace a slower pace of life, a lifestyle that was as much about self-reflection as it was about personal pride. I found solace in the rhythm of small-town living, in the simple exchange of pleasantries with neighbors, and in the satisfaction of cultivating a home that was entirely my own. However, adjusting to a quiet life did not mean that my instincts for vigilance were entirely dormant. Every detail of my new property was meticulously maintained. I spent weekends landscaping the garden and carefully choosing plants that would thrive in the local climate. Among these were my favorite blue hydrangeas, vivid bursts of color that, to me, symbolized both beauty and resilience. I had chosen them with the care and precision of someone who knew the importance of small details. Living in Pleasant Valley, I believed the transition from my former adrenaline-fueled existence to domestic calm would be seamless. Yet even as I arranged flower beds and enjoyed the serenity of suburban life, I kept my past in the back of my mind, a quiet reminder that the skills honed through years of FBI work were never truly left behind. They were now the silent guardians of my newfound peace. Thus began my new life in Pleasant Valley, a life defined by routine, gentle pleasures, and a heartfelt hope that my bungalow would provide the solace that had long been my dream. Though I had stepped away from the dangers of the field, every day was a careful balancing act between enjoying tranquility and staying prepared for life's unpredictable twists. And in that balance, I began to craft the next chapter of my extraordinary journey. Not long after settling into my peaceful bungalow in Pleasant Valley, an unexpected challenge cropped up in the form of a seemingly trivial matter. A dispute over my blue hydrangeas. I had meticulously planted these hydrangeas to brighten my front yard, their cool hues a reflection of my refined taste and a nod to the beauty of my new surroundings. To me, they were more than just flowers, they were a small emblem of the fresh start I had envisioned. However, the tranquility of my new life was disrupted when the local HOA president, Mildred McMillan, took issue with my choice in floral decor. Mildred argued that the vivid blue of my hydrangeas did not fit within the strict aesthetic guidelines prescribed for the neighborhood. In her eyes, every element of the landscape had to conform to a particular standard, and my hydrangeas, though naturally beautiful, were deemed an unwelcome splash of color that threatened the carefully curated look of Pleasant Valley. I found Mildred's objections both surprising and frustrating. I had chosen those hydrangeas after careful consideration, believing that a bit of individuality could enhance rather than diminish the community's overall charm. It seemed to me that the rules, designed perhaps to promote a uniform look, had no place in the expression of simple, natural beauty. Despite the HOA's reputation for maintaining order, there was a part of me that resented the idea that my personal taste could be overruled by a board intent on controlling every detail. When Mildred raised her objections, it wasn't with the subtlety one might expect. Instead, she made it clear that my blue hydrangeas were a violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic norms, setting the stage for a conflict that I sensed was only beginning. While I was proud of my garden and the care I invested in it, I also believed that diversity, in both nature and character, was something to be celebrated, not suppressed. Her disapproval struck at the core of my desire for independence. After all, I had chosen this place seeking peace and authenticity. The notion that my expression of personal style could be deemed unacceptable was a bitter pill to swallow. As I listened to Mildred's complaints, it became evident that this was not just about flowers, it was about control, conformity, and the overreach of authority into personal space. Thus, the controversy over my hydrangeas marked the beginning of an unexpected confrontation between a former FBI agent intent on preserving his freedom and an HOA determined to enforce uniformity. Little did I know that this clash over a simple garden display would soon escalate into a much larger battle, one that would challenge the very principles of individuality and autonomy I had come here to enjoy. Mildred McMillan's dissatisfaction with my blue hydrangeas soon escalated into a full-blown ultimatum that threatened the very essence of my newfound peace. As I stood in my front yard, taking pride in the carefully cultivated burst of color that my hydrangeas provided, Mildred appeared with an air of unyielding authority. Without any semblance of subtlety, she demanded that I conform to her vision of neighborhood uniformity. According to her, the harmonious palette of Pleasant Valley required a strict adherence to particular shades, and my blue hydrangeas were an unacceptable aberration. Either you repaint your hydrangeas pink to match the neighborhood standard or you hand over your entire house so we can convert it into a community garden, she declared with steely resolve. The demand was as baffling as it was audacious. I had never expected my personal choice in garden design to be met with such draconian measures. To be forced either to alter the natural beauty of my own property or to sacrifice my home altogether was an affront to every principle of personal freedom I held dear. As I listened to Mildred's ultimatum, a mix of disbelief and indignation surged within me. In all my years, both during my covert operations as an FBI agent and in my quiet moments here in Pleasant Valley, I had never encountered such an extreme challenge to my personal autonomy. My bungalow, my garden, and every carefully chosen detail were expressions of who I was. They were not up for negotiation, nor could they be forcibly transformed to appease someone else's narrow vision of order. The confrontation was more than a simple dispute over aesthetics. It represented the clash between individuality and the oppressive drive for conformity. Mildred appeared to symbolize the overbearing nature of an organization that sought to dictate every aspect of personal expression within Pleasant Valley. Her demands, far from being reasonable suggestions, were a stark reminder that in some communities, conformity was prized above all else, even if it meant sacrificing one's right to self-expression. At that moment, I realized that this was not merely a matter of flowers or paint. It was a test, a challenge to defend my right to live the way I chose. I was not a man who had spent years outsmarting criminals and negotiating dangerous deals only to be bullied by someone wielding HOA regulations as her weapon. Mildred's aggressive stance forced me to reconsider the boundaries between private property and communal oversight, and I knew that a compromise was not an option. My mind raced through scenarios reminiscent of past high-stakes encounters. I recalled cases where I had faced down the Russian mafia and negotiated delicate truces under the most intense pressure. If I could navigate those treacherous waters, how could I allow a petty dictate about flower colors to undermine my peace? With steely determination, I made it clear that I would not be coerced into relinquishing my individuality or my property. I calmly informed Mildred that any attempt to force compliance on my part would be met with the full measure of my experience and resolve. I challenged her notion that a private garden could be subjected to arbitrary standards. My property is my own, I stated firmly. I have maintained these hydrangeas with care and have every right to express my individual taste in my garden just as I have every right to safeguard the integrity of my home. The tension in the air was palpable as the two of us stood amid the carefully tended splashes of color, the blue hydrangeas a silent, proud declaration of my identity. The battle lines were drawn not merely over paint and petals but over the fundamental right to live authentically, free from the encroachment of overzealous regulation. I left that confrontation resolved. The offer to repaint my hydrangeas pink or surrender my home was unacceptable. I would stand firm. That day marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle against an HOA that sought to impose its own narrow vision of conformity on my life. It was the first step in a battle that would require every ounce of my determination to preserve the sanctuary I had fought so hard to create. In the wake of Mildred's outrageous ultimatum, I knew I had to send an unequivocal message: I was not a pushover. Over the years, I had faced adversaries far more dangerous than a misinformed HOA president. With a calm confidence honed by years of dealing with criminals, even outsmarting notorious organizations like the Russian mafia, I made it abundantly clear that I would not surrender to arbitrary rules or unreasonable demands. During a tense conversation with Mildred, I recounted my past experiences with an air of quiet pride. I have faced challenges that would make your latest demand seem trivial, I declared. Every word was carefully measured, echoing the resolve of a man who had spent his career navigating treacherous situations where the stakes were immeasurably high. In contrast, her confrontation over a few blooms on my front lawn appeared laughably insignificant. Yet, it was a battle I could not ignore, for it went straight to the core of my right to live independently and according to my own terms. Mildred's demand, to repaint my blue hydrangeas pink or give up my house for a community garden, was not simply a matter of aesthetics. It was an affront to the principles I had built my life upon. I had chosen those hydrangeas deliberately as a symbol of my individuality and as a representation of the vibrant legacy I intended to nurture in my new home. For her to insist on a uniform appearance was to force conformity on something that was meant to be a personal expression of freedom. I explained to her, with all the patience and firmness I could muster, that my experiences had taught me that genuine strength comes from standing by one's convictions. I reminded her that, in my years of service, I had seen the consequences of yielding to undue pressure, a lesson that had been paid for in blood and perseverance. My property, I said, reflects my history, my struggles, and ultimately, my triumphs. I made it clear that I would never allow it to be reduced to a blank slate for someone else's vision. The conversation grew increasingly charged as I recounted just a few of the many perilous situations I had successfully navigated. I spoke not with arrogance, but with a quiet assurance that I could handle any challenge thrown my way. My tone was steady as I warned Mildred that if she continued to push her agenda, I would be forced to defend my rights by every means at my disposal. I even hinted at my network of contacts and the resources I had built over years in the field, a network that had once been crucial in taking down dangerous criminal enterprises. By the end of our exchange, it was clear that Mildred's eyes had opened just a fraction to the reality of the situation. The message was unmistakable: I was not someone who could be bullied by petty regulations or coerced into conformity. While she persisted in her demands, my stance had hardened into something unyielding, a declaration that my personal choices would remain intact, no matter how much pressure was applied. With that conversation concluding, I took a moment to reflect on the larger implications of what had transpired. It wasn't merely about hydrangeas, it was about asserting my autonomy in a community that valued uniformity over individuality. I had made it unequivocally known that the sacrifices I had made in my former life demanded respect, and that my right to express myself, whether through a carefully tended garden or through the legacy of my own personal history, was not up for debate. In that moment, I vowed to stand my ground. I would not let Mildred, or anyone else, diminish the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I was prepared to use every tool at my disposal, including the lessons learned from facing down far more dangerous foes, to ensure that my home, my identity, and my legacy remained sacred and inviolable. Mildred's persistence took an even darker turn when she began to threaten direct repercussions using the strict regulations of the HOA. Despite my impeccably maintained lawn and the clear evidence of conscientious care, she vowed to make my life uncomfortable by enforcing every obscure guideline at her disposal. From late notices on lawn maintenance to minute infractions that could be interpreted as violations, her threats grew more menacing by the day. During one particularly heated discussion, Mildred declared that she would leverage every available HOA regulation against me. "Your lawn might be immaculate in your eyes," she sneered, "but that does not exempt you from the rules of the community." There was a cold precision in her tone as she listed potential violations, each one trivial in isolation but collectively designed to wear down my resolve. It was as if she intended to trap me in a web of bureaucratic red tape, making even the slightest deviation from their standards a reason for punitive measures. I listened intently, realizing that her strategy was to use the authority of the HOA not as a guide, but as a weapon. No matter how many times I had demonstrated responsibility, there was always a loophole she could exploit. Her threats were not mere words, they were a deliberate attempt to intimidate me into submission, to force me to conform to a system that valued uniformity above all else. Drawing on my years as an FBI agent, I knew that bureaucracies often harbored hidden agendas, and that power could be abused in subtle but destructive ways. I calmly explained to Mildred that my property was maintained to the highest standards, not just because I cared about appearances, but because I respected the very principles of order that she so zealously tried to impose. "Rules," I countered, "are meant to guide, not to oppress. I have followed all guidelines to the letter, and any further claims to the contrary will be met with documented proof of compliance." The conversation escalated as Mildred continued to threaten actions that would make my everyday life a nightmare. Every time I mentioned the possibility of a minor infraction, she responded with a cold reminder of fines, penalties, and even legal actions that could be pursued. It was clear that in her eyes, the power of the HOA was absolute, and that I was a target for enforcement if I did not conform precisely to their prescribed aesthetic. As the tension mounted, I resolved that I would not allow her to use the regulations as a tool of personal vendetta. I had encountered many scenarios in my past that involved the misuse of authority, and I was prepared to document every threat and every baseless claim she issued. I assured her that any infraction would be challenged vigorously with evidence, and that my impeccable record as both a homeowner and a former FBI agent was my shield against such abuse. I also made it abundantly clear that I would not be bullied into submission by vague interpretations of community guidelines. I stressed that if she believed there were any violations, she should present them concretely. "Find a single actual, verifiable violation on my property," I challenged, "and I will address it. But until then, your threats are nothing more than empty words meant to intimidate." The dialogue became a battle of wills, her inflexible interpretation of the rules pitted against my steadfast refusal to be manipulated. Every claim she made was met with precise facts and the documentation that every inch of my property met, or exceeded, the standards required. The exchange was a testament to the fact that while regulations exist to maintain order, they should never be exploited to suppress personal freedom or genuine quality of life. In that confrontation, it was clear that our battle would be fought not on the grounds of property aesthetics alone but on the principle of fairness and the proper limits of authority. I left the discussion with the resolve that I would defend my right to enjoy my home without the specter of constant punitive threats looming over me. The HOA might have the power to enforce rules, but I now understood that the true measure of authority was the ability to enforce it fairly, and that is a standard I was determined to uphold at all costs. Not one to back down when confronted with baseless threats, I decided to turn the tables on Mildred. With my impeccable record and the carefully maintained condition of my property as clear evidence, I issued a challenge that would expose the frivolity of her claims. I declared that, for every so-called violation she could identify on my property, I would ask her one pointed question. In effect, I was offering her a chance to prove that her accusations held any merit. I stood in my front yard, a space I had nurtured with care, and calmly informed Mildred, if you can find even one genuine, verifiable violation, I'll be happy to address it. But until then, every claim you make is without foundation, and for each unfounded claim, I have a question about how your accusations align with the way our community is actually governed. My tone was firm and unyielding, a reminder that I was not new to challenges and that I had faced far more dangerous adversaries than a petty board member's interpretation of regulations. Mildred's eyes narrowed as she considered the challenge. It was one thing to issue a blanket threat, but quite another to stand up and invite scrutiny. I was effectively forcing her to subject every claim, no matter how trivial, to rigorous examination in front of a community that valued transparency and fairness. My challenge was not only a test of her accusations but also a measure of the HOA's overall integrity. Over the next few days, Mildred scoured my property for any detail that might be spun into a violation. I watched her quietly as she examined every corner of my perfectly maintained lawn, each shrub, and even the minutiae of my garden decor. The exercise exposed the absurdity behind her demands and underscored the selective enforcement of HOA regulations. I had left no stone unturned. From the exact placement of each flower bed to the precise alignment of my lawn furniture, every detail had been executed with care. At one point, Mildred pointed out what she deemed a minor infraction, a slightly misaligned gnome statue tucked away near the garden's edge. With a measured smile, I seized that moment to turn the tables once again. Since you found this infraction, I said, please tell me, how does this single discrepancy justify your ongoing campaign against my entire property? And while we're at it, would you care to explain why the HOA refuses to investigate reports of embezzlement within its own ranks? The questions were designed to expose not only the triviality of the violation but also to hint at deeper issues of corruption and misuse of power within the HOA. Mildred's face reddened with indignation, yet the challenge had already begun to shift the focus of the debate. No longer was it simply about my blue hydrangeas or the layout of my garden. Instead, it evolved into a discussion about the legitimacy of the entire regulatory process. Her inability to provide a satisfactory explanation for even this minor violation increasingly undermined her authority. It became clear that her threats were less about protecting community standards and more about exerting control for its own sake. The challenge quickly drew the attention of neighbors and members of the community. Some supported my call for clear, objective standards, others were simply curious to see how far Mildred would go to enforce rules that seemed arbitrary at best. This growing scrutiny further emboldened me. I continued to press the matter openly, ensuring that every point was documented and that the community was fully aware of the discrepancies between the HOA's proclaimed ideals and their actual enforcement. By standing up to Mildred in this way, I not only defended my property but also spotlighted the need for greater accountability within the HOA. The challenge was a turning point, a demonstration that no one was above scrutiny and that even the most rigorous regulations must be applied fairly and transparently. I made it clear that I expected full accountability and that I was prepared to hold every member of the board to the highest standard. In doing so, I challenged the entire system to justify its claims, and in that contest, I firmly established that personal property rights and individual freedoms were not to be compromised at the whim of an overzealous board. After days of searching, Mildred finally uncovered a so-called violation, a minor infraction involving a misaligned gnome statue in my meticulously maintained garden. The accusation, flimsy in its nature, was everything I had anticipated, trivial and demonstrative of a selective interpretation of rules. Seizing this moment, I turned the challenge to Mildred with one incisive question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Standing beside the contested gnome, I calmly addressed her, "Since you claim this is a violation, could you explain how a minor misplacement justifies your ongoing harassment of my property? And while you are at it, why doesn't the HOA investigate the serious allegations of embezzlement swirling within its own ranks?" The question was not meant merely to provoke a response about the gnome, it was designed to highlight the glaring inconsistencies in how the HOA applied its regulations and to question its overall integrity. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was an invitation for Mildred to reveal more than just her disdain for my personal taste, it was a challenge to the very legitimacy of the regulatory practices that govern our community. Her refusal to answer directly, and the hesitation that followed, only served to underscore the deeper issues I suspected were festering within the HOA. Neighbors who had gathered to observe the confrontation exchanged knowing glances. Many had silently agreed that the focus on a gnome, of all things, was a pretext for larger grievances. My challenge had effectively shifted the narrative away from personal property disputes to a broader discussion about accountability and transparency within the organization. Mildred's face contorted with a mixture of anger and discomfort as she struggled to provide a cogent reply. Her inability to address the second part of my question, regarding the alleged embezzlement, was telling. It exposed not only the trivial nature of her initial infraction claim but also the looming specter of corruption within the HOA's leadership. In that charged moment, the gnome became a symbolic pivot point, a seemingly insignificant detail that highlighted the absurdity of enforcing arbitrary rules while neglecting far more serious issues of governance. By focusing on the gnome, Mildred had inadvertently validated my position that the true problem lay not in my property, but in the broader misuse of power and selective enforcement practiced by the HOA. The community's response was swift. Murmurs of agreement and disapproval swept through the small crowd, reinforcing the idea that the issue extended far beyond a single decoration gone awry. The incident served as a rallying cry for those who believed that such trivialities should not overshadow genuine accountability. In that defining moment, the misaligned gnome transformed from a minor nuisance into a clarion call for transparency, a call that resonated with every homeowner tired of arbitrary interference. Despite my pointed question regarding the HOA's integrity and the supposed misalignment of a garden gnome, Mildred refused to offer any meaningful explanation. Her silence was deafening. An admission that perhaps her claims were less about genuine community standards and more about an attempt to wield power arbitrarily. Rather than engage with my inquiries, she stubbornly clung to her original position, insisting that all rules must be strictly enforced, no matter how minor the infraction. Undeterred by her refusal, I pressed on. I had long suspected that beneath the veneer of neighborhood perfection, corruption festered in the depths of the HOA's management. My investigation had uncovered troubling hints of misappropriated funds and dubious decisions that seemed designed solely to benefit those in power. Mildred's inability to address the serious allegations, coupled with her focus on a triviality like a misaligned gnome, only confirmed my suspicions. As I began to compile the evidence I had gathered over the past several weeks, it became clear that the issues ran deep. Photographs of meticulously documented property conditions, copies of correspondence with the HOA, and even testimonies from fellow residents who had experienced similar overreach all painted a picture of systemic abuse. Every piece of evidence that I brought forward underlined the fact that my impeccable property was not in violation of any genuine rule, instead, it was the target of an arbitrary crackdown designed to enforce conformity. My resolve hardened with every unresponsive, dismissive statement from Mildred. The silence that followed my inquiries was now accompanied by a growing body of evidence, a dossier that I knew would soon force the truth into the open. I vowed in that moment not only to defend my own rights but also to expose the corruption that had corrupted the HOA's purpose. With the mounting evidence in hand, I prepared to take the matter further. Mildred's refusal to engage with substantive questions provided me with the ammunition needed to challenge the board's actions on a much larger scale. I was determined that the truth about the HOA's mismanagement would not remain hidden any longer. In that pivotal moment, as the community watched and whispered in quiet solidarity, I recognized that the battle was no longer just about a misaligned gnome, it was a fight for transparency, accountability, and the very rights of homeowners everywhere. And although Mildred continued to refuse any honest dialogue, her silence spoke volumes, setting the stage for the next phase of my campaign against corruption. Armed with undeniable evidence of corruption within the HOA and faced with Mildred's continued evasion, I knew the time had come to act decisively. I presented my findings to the local police, partnering with the chief, someone who also believed in fairness and integrity, to expose the systemic abuses within the HOA. The investigation quickly escalated as it became clear that Mildred and several board members had been engaging in embezzlement, manipulating regulations to serve their own interests. Under pressure from law enforcement and with community members rallying behind me, the board's inner circle began to fracture. Several members distanced themselves from Mildred, eager to avoid prosecution and the taint of corruption. In what felt like a dramatic cleansing of a long-corrupt institution, the HOA was overhauled and a new, honest board was elected. With the scandal resolved, my blue hydrangeas, and by extension, my personal taste and property, were finally safe from unwarranted intrusion. In the days that followed, I was invited to give a community gardening workshop, a gesture that signified not only a return to normalcy but also a recognition of the importance of transparency and self-expression in our shared environment. It was a quiet celebration of reclaiming my space after a turbulent battle for autonomy. Yet just as I began to embrace the new calm, life reminded me that adventure never truly leaves you. As I prepared for the workshop, I was approached by the FBI with a request for a new operation, a challenge that promised to draw me back into the very world I had once left behind. The call to duty was impossible to ignore. My passion for justice and my decades of experience in high-stakes operations stirred within me once more. After a moment of reflection, I made the decision, would return to action. Although gardening had offered a welcome respite, I felt compelled to answer the call of a new dangerous mission. With a sense of determination tempered by the lessons of my recent battles, I resolved to set aside my green thumb temporarily and step back into the role of an agent of justice. And so, with the community's confidence restored and my personal space once again secure, I prepared for my next mission, ready to tackle the next case with the same resolve and resourcefulness that had defined my career. The balance between peace and duty had shifted once again, and as I walked away from my workshop, I knew the journey was far from over. With the weight of irrefutable evidence in my hands and a determination forged through years of facing down danger, I knew that silence was no longer an option. After gathering all the documentation, from detailed photographs of my immaculate property and the absurdly fabricated infractions to the damning testimony of contradictory HOA correspondence, I made the decision to take every piece of evidence directly to the local police. I arranged a meeting with the chief, a dedicated officer known for his integrity and commitment to justice, and presented the case in painstaking detail. The conversation in the cramped, dimly lit office of the police station was measured but resolute. I laid out the timeline, from the first infraction regarding my blue hydrangeas to the gradual escalation of demands and intimidation from Mildred Macmillan and her accomplices on the HOA board. Every document was scrutinized, every minor detail cross-referenced with the records that the HOA claimed validated their overzealous enforcement. I explained how the tiny misaligned gnome and other fabricated violations were nothing more than tools used to justify a covert scheme of embezzlement and power abuse. The records I provided painted a picture of a board that had strayed from its duty of maintaining community standards and was instead exploiting its position for personal gain. The chief listened intently. His eyes narrowed in skepticism as he examined the evidence, yet gradually, a look of understanding and determination replaced his initial reserve. As someone who had spent years on the streets confronting real criminals, he appreciated the meticulous detail and the importance of curbing authority when it crossed the line. I could sense that he, too, was tired of bureaucratic abuse, and that tonight, the scales of justice were about to be rebalanced. We discussed the corrupt practices that had plagued the HOA, from inflated fines and sham violations to the suspicious allocation of funds that left little room for genuine community improvement. I even mentioned anonymous tips I'd received about embezzlement practices within the board and how several members had been aware of these discrepancies yet chose to remain silent. My words resonated with the chief, who revealed that his department had been monitoring similar complaints from other residents. With the evidence firmly in our hands, we agreed to launch an internal investigation in collaboration with the district attorney's office. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders knowing that my struggle would soon be scrutinized by professionals who were beyond the control of the HOA. Over the following days, the police department meticulously reviewed every document and cross-checked financial records provided by the community. As the investigation unfolded, the chief's respect for my resolve grew. He commended my courage, remarking that it wasn't every day a former FBI agent stepped forward to expose such corruption. During one of our follow-up meetings, the chief informed me that the investigation was taking a dramatic turn. Multiple board members were now cooperating, fearing that their own complicity in Mildred's scheme would soon be exposed. The evidence I had provided was just the tipping point needed to crack open a case that had long been simmering under the surface. I felt vindicated. My years of experience had taught me that the truth always finds a way to come out. By the time I left the police station that day, I knew that the battle against the HOA's corruption was in its decisive phase. The partnership forged with the chief was not just a professional collaboration, but a shared commitment to ensuring that no one, even an overzealous board, could exploit power for personal enrichment. In that small, determined office, the foundation was laid for a major upheaval in the way our community would be governed, and the bright blue of my hydrangeas shone as a symbol of defiant individualism against the forces of conformity. Soon after I handed over my evidence, the investigation began to unravel the dark underbelly of the HOA. The inquiry expanded beyond my private dispute and soon involved an in-depth review of Mildred McMillan's actions and the board's financial practices. As the local police and the district attorney's office joined forces, the once impenetrable shield of authority around the HOA started to crack. The investigation revealed a network of embezzlement and mismanagement that stretched across multiple years. Financial records indicated unexplained discrepancies in the allocation of community funds, and interviews with longtime residents painted a picture of a board that had long been operating in secrecy. Mildred, who had once staunchly defended her authority, suddenly found herself isolated as board members began to distance themselves. Fearing that association with her would only bring further scrutiny and possible charges, many on the board turned against her in a bid for self-preservation. In a series of dramatic meetings, the evidence against Mildred and her cohorts was presented to the board. The once feared HOA seemed to crumble under the weight of incontrovertible documentation linking its leadership to fraudulent activities. In hushed tones and with a palpable sense of urgency, board members began to cooperate with the authorities, hoping to avoid personal prosecution. Their testimonies, paired with the paper trail I had provided, painted a comprehensive picture of corruption, a system built not on genuine community service, but on self-serving schemes that had exploited residents for profit. The board's internal cohesion disintegrated rapidly. In an effort to mitigate the fallout, several members publicly distanced themselves from Mildred and called for sweeping reforms within the HOA's structure. The community, once intimidated by the strict enforcement of petty violations, now witnessed the dramatic unmasking of a corrupt leadership. It was a turning point that signaled a strong desire among residents for accountability and transparency. News of the investigation and the board's internal strife spread quickly, and the community began to rally behind those who had fought for change. I observed that my battle, which had started over a dispute about hydrangeas, had evolved into a larger movement demanding fairness and integrity in local governance. For residents tired of arbitrary punishments and secretive financial practices, this investigation was a breath of fresh air, an opportunity to reclaim their community. In the midst of the turmoil, it became clear that Mildred's power was waning. The board's members, now under the intense scrutiny of law enforcement, appeared ready to submit to reforms that would realign the HOA with its original mission, serving the community, not controlling it. The evidence not only validated my claims but also acted as a catalyst for widespread change. And as the investigation continued, the once unchallengeable authority of the HOA began to disintegrate, heralding a hopeful future for Pleasant Valley. In the weeks following the investigation, significant changes swept through the once oppressive HOA. With the corruption exposed and Mildred McMillan's leadership irrevocably tarnished, a full cleanup of the board was swiftly implemented. Residents witnessed the election of a new, honest board, one dedicated to restoring fairness, transparency, and community spirit. The transformation was palpable. The new board, consisting of individuals with a genuine passion for public service and an unwavering commitment to accountability, set out to rebuild trust. Their primary goal was to ensure that every decision made, from minor landscaping issues to major financial allocations, would be handled with the utmost integrity. For the first time in years, residents felt that their voices mattered and that the HOA was working for them, not against them. On a sunny afternoon, I strolled through my garden, my gaze lingering on the blue hydrangeas that had once sparked a fierce dispute. Now, they stood as symbols of resilience and personal freedom, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the spirit of individuality could not be suppressed. With the new board in place, I knew that my beloved hydrangeas, and my right to cultivate them in the manner of my choosing, were finally safe. Community meetings became a forum for open dialogue and collaborative decision-making. Neighbors, once fearful of punitive actions, now shared ideas and supported initiatives that benefited everyone. The transformation of the HOA not only vindicated my struggle but also breathed new life into Pleasant Valley as a whole. The process was an exemplary demonstration of accountability in action. A direct rebuke to the arbitrary rules of the past. As the dust settled and the reform took hold, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The battle for my property had been far more than a personal skirmish, it had ignited a movement to restore the values of transparency and fairness in our community. With the corrupt elements removed and a renewed sense of purpose reigning, the future of the neighborhood looked brighter than ever. In that revitalized spirit, my hydrangeas continued to bloom in their natural, glorious blue, a testament to the fact that personal expression and a well-tended life can flourish when unburdened by undue authority. The new HOA board embraced change, and in turn, Pleasant Valley emerged as a community where individuality and communal harmony coexisted in honest, vibrant unity. Just as the dust settled over the reformed HOA, a surprising opportunity arrived. A community gardening workshop invitation that acknowledged both my struggle and my love for cultivating beauty. For a moment, it felt as if life had come full circle. After the intense battles over hydrangeas, regulations, and the corruption that had plagued our neighborhood, I was now being celebrated for simply nurturing a garden. The workshop was a symbol of renewal, a chance to share my passion with neighbors who had once been silent witnesses to my journey. On the day of the workshop, as I prepared to offer gardening tips and share insights on how to maintain one's property with care, a calm enthusiasm spread among the residents. The atmosphere was uplifting, a sharp contrast to the tense skirmishes of the past months. I eagerly greeted those who gathered, hoping that this event would further cement the community's newfound commitment to transparency and mutual support. Just as the first few attendees began to settle in, I was approached by an unexpected visitor. In a quiet, unassuming manner, a representative from the FBI arrived with a new operation request. The conversation was brief but charged with the unmistakable energy of duty. Once again, my extensive background in high-stakes operations was being summoned. The call to action was clear: I was needed for a dangerous mission that promised to test the very skills I had honed during my years with the FBI. For a split second, the workshop fell silent. It was as if the peaceful environment of Pleasant Valley was poised at a crossroads, between the promise of domestic tranquility and the allure of high-octane adventure. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the peaceful moments spent nurturing my garden and rebuilding my community were deeply rewarding. On the other, the thrill of my former life, the challenge of outsmarting dangerous criminals and facing peril head-on, beckoned me with equal intensity. After a brief pause filled with thoughtful reflection, I made my decision. With a nod to the eager faces of the workshop attendees and a determined glint in my eye, I announced that I would have to set aside my gardening hobby, for now, to return to action. Though leaving the workshop and the serene life I had carefully built in Pleasant Valley was not easy, I knew that my duty to serve justice was a call I could not ignore. As I prepared to depart, the FBI representative and I exchanged firm, respectful words that acknowledged both my past accomplishments and the challenges ahead. It was clear that while I had embraced a simpler life here, the spirit of service and the drive to protect the truth still burned strong within me. Walking away from the workshop, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My journey had taken me from undercover operations to the personal battles for my property, and now, it was leading me back into the fray of national security. The balance between peace and duty would always be delicate, but I trusted that the same determination that had seen me through countless challenges would now guide me as I embarked on this new, dangerous mission. And so, I stepped forward into the unknown, leaving behind the calm of my garden for one more round of high-stakes action, ever ready to answer the call when justice demanded it.